The Library Ghost. My name is Helen Grant, and I'm an author living in Scotland. My other work includes the Carnegie shortlisted novel The Vanishing of Katharina Linden and the new thriller Silent Saturday. The following is a recording of a ghost story reading at the Library of Innerpeffray at Hallowe'en 2013. Innerpeffray was founded in 1680 and is Scotland's oldest lending library. I was asked to be writer-in-residence for a day and chose the 31st of October as this was the library's last day of opening before it closed for the winter. I challenged myself to write a ghost story inspired by and set in the library. I was hoping that the spirits of Innerpeffray would supply me with plenty of inspiration, and I'm glad to say that they did. I created a portmanteau-style work of 3 ghost stories set in the library, connected by an overarching narrative, and read it out to an audience that evening. This tale is the middle story of the 3.
Lilith's story, the unreturned volume. As you know, began Lilith, until very recently the library used to lend out all of its books. Until recently, said Fraser, looking a little confused. I thought that had ended in the 1960s. Lilith looked down her long and elegant nose at him. 40 or 50 years is a very short time in a life as long as the libraries. She put her head on one side coquettishly. May I continue? Oh, I beg your pardon, please, said Fraser awkwardly. Very well. As I was saying, in times gone by, the library used to lend out the books. Of course, they had to stop that in the end, because nowadays a book printed in the 15 or 1600s is far too rare and valuable to lend to anyone. But originally, local people might come to the library and borrow what they liked, signing for it in the borrower's register. I suppose you've seen the registers. Yes, said Fraser, for he had. There were 3 registers, the oldest dating back to 1747, with the loans carefully written out in brown and faded ink. The earliest entries took the form of a promise to return the book, which was named along with the date of the loan and the borrower. When the book was returned, the entry was simply struck through with a cross. The borrower undertook to pay a penalty should he fail to return the volume, and indeed in a few cases the librarian had added the words "note sent" to the entry. It was clear that the return of the books was scrupulously monitored. Well, Lilith went on, in the middle part of the 1700s, a local man by the name of Robertson borrowed an interesting work about the flora and fauna of Scotland, illustrated with a series of detailed and beautiful woodcuts. This Robertson is supposed to have been a rather surly man, unsmiling and taciturn, and resentful of his poor circumstances. He was an educated person from a formerly wealthy family that had fallen on hard times, so that his house and his clothing and belongings were all rather shabbier than one might have expected from someone so well-spoken. He considered that he had married beneath his rank, and accordingly he bullied his poor wife unmercifully, constantly pointing out her many failings. She, for her part, regarded him with mixed terror for the hard words and blows he gave her, and admiration for his great intellect. I do not know whether his intellect was really so very great, but at any rate he told her it was so, and she believed him. Robertson was very proud of his learning and wished to maintain it, but of course his slender means did not allow him the luxury of purchasing books of his own. The Library of Innerpeffray was therefore a great benefit to him, since it enabled him to continue his studies without much more expense than the shoe leather it cost him walking to and from the library. He was always very careful to return the books on time to avoid paying a fine, and at home he handled them as though they had been bound in cloth of gold. His wife was not allowed so much as to touch them. Now Robertson had not long borrowed the book of Scottish flora and fauna when he fell sick of typhoid fever. It was soon clear to his terrified wife that he would not survive it. As the sickness progressed, he became delirious and he began to rave about the book he had borrowed, calling for it to be given to him and insisting that he must return it. At first the poor wife dared not bring the volume to him, for she was under a very strict instruction never to lay a finger on any of his books. At last, however, he raved so violently that she gave it to him, hoping that it might calm him. Robertson touched the book, and sometimes he even hugged it to himself as though afraid that someone might take it from him. At other times he cast it aside, hardly seeming to know what it was. At last he died, with the book still lying among the filthy and disordered sheets. The widow, who had been fortunate enough to escape infection, used what little funds she had to see that her husband was decently buried in the kirkyard at Innerpeffray, and this was done as soon as possible. Only a mound marked the spot where Robertson lay, as she was unable to pay for a stone marker. However, she hoped that in the course of time she might gather together enough money for one. Some weeks passed, and the Librarian of Innerpeffray became aware that the Book of Scottish Flora and Fauna, with the beautiful and distinctive woodcuts in it, had not been returned. A note was sent, but to no effect. The book failed to appear. The librarian considered the matter, having a vague remembrance that there had been a Robertson among the number of fever victims who had been buried recently. Was this the same Robertson who had borrowed the book? To demand the return of a book from a grieving widow was a very difficult matter, but on the other hand the librarian did not see his way to abandoning the book, which was both beautiful and useful. In the end he determined that he would call upon the lady himself, using utmost tact and civility, and see if he could take the book away. He was a little taken aback when he came to the house that had belonged to Mr. Robertson. It was a poor-looking place of mean dimensions, with a few chickens scratching disconsolately in the yard. He had expected something a little finer simply from the airs that Robertson had given himself. Nevertheless, he wanted the book back, so he knocked on the weathered door, and when Mrs. Robertson appeared, wiping her reddened hands on her apron, he explained who he was. The lady seemed highly disconcerted, but unwilling to turn away her visitor. She invited him inside with many apologies for the poorness of the house and the meagreness of her hospitality. She dusted a chair for him, but the librarian declined to sit. With some embarrassment, but also with determination, he set out the reason for his visit and asked whether he might take the book away with him. The fine, he said, could be waived under the circumstances. He expected that the book would be produced immediately, but to his surprise Mrs. Robertson prevaricated. At first she said that she was not sure what book he meant. Then she said she thought that her husband had returned it. The librarian assured her that he had not. Then Mrs. Robertson tried to make light of the matter, asking whether it was really so very important that the book be returned at all, since it was such a dusty old thing. The librarian was conscious of her sad status as a widow, but even so he began to feel a little irritated at this. The book was a fine one and not easily replaced, he told her. He pressed her to produce it, and finally he insisted in rather rougher language than he had used before. At this the lady burst into floods of tears, burying her face in her apron. It took some coaxing on the librarian's part before she finally admitted that the book was no longer in the house. Where was it? She had placed it in her husband's coffin, and it had gone with him to the grave. It was not clear why Mrs. Robertson had done this terrible and unfortunate thing. Perhaps she had not understood that the book was not her husband's, and had put it into the coffin with him with some vague sense of offering him comfort in his last journey, much as the ancient Egyptians used to fill their tombs with furniture and even foodstuffs. Or perhaps the worm had turned at last, and taking out all the pent-up spite of years of being bullied by her husband, she had piled the hated symbols of his supposed superiority into his coffin with them, and sent him off to the grave worm with him. Whatever the reason, the fact was that she had done it. The library's book of Scottish plants and animals was buried 6 feet under the turf in Innerpeffray kirkyard. The librarian was horrified and furious, but there was very little to be done. He could hardly insist that the body be exhumed, and looking around the poverty-stricken house he could see that any demand for recompense would be a waste of time. He quitted the house in an evil temper and went back to the library, where he took a quill pen and ink and wrote "Lost" next to the entry for the book in the borrower's register. I believe this is the only instance of this being done. The librarian presumed that this was the end of the matter, but it was not. One afternoon that autumn he became very engrossed in some cataloguing work, so that he left the library after night had fallen. It was a dark night, but the air was still, so he was able to take with him a lantern with a candle burning in it to light his way home. He locked the library building behind him and began to make his way carefully along the path that runs beside the kirkyard wall. Fortunately, he was not a nervous or imaginative person, otherwise he might have felt nervous walking past the kirkyard with its lichenous tombstones sticking up out of the earth like jagged teeth. He was used to working in the library whose windows overlooked it, so the memorials were old friends rather than objects of terror. As he proceeded along the path, peering ahead of him, he saw someone come around the corner of the kirkyard wall, moving towards him at a slow pace. The librarian was not particularly afraid. In addition to the lantern, he carried a stout walking stick, and besides, it was not very likely that a robber would lurk outside a library. There were much richer pickings to be had elsewhere, so he called out boldly, asking who was there. There was no reply. Still the figure came on, discernible only as a dark shape moving laboriously up the path towards the library, as though dragging itself with the utmost weariness. "Who goes there?" cried the librarian again, and he let the stick be seen. But the figure continued to approach him in silence. Not a word did it say in reply, and not only that, the librarian could hear no footsteps on the path. Nearer it came, and nearer, and still not a single sound could be heard. The expression, as silent as the grave, floated through the librarian's head. Now beginning to be really unnerved, the librarian raised the lantern and stepped boldly forward. The feeble yellow light from the candle within the glass fell upon the face of the figure and upon the thing it carried in its arms, pressed close to its breast. It was Robertson, drawn and haggard from his last illness, and in his arms was the book he had borrowed. The librarian took one look at that gaunt face with its deeply sunken eyes and fell back in horror. Robertson seemed unaware of his presence. The book clutched tightly to him. He trudged silently past the librarian along the path towards the library. In his wake he left the most indescribable smell of grave mould. The librarian pressed his handkerchief to his nose, but with wide eyes he watched the ghost's progress towards the building. Robertson walked right up to the door, and then it seemed that he vanished. The light from the candle lantern was so feeble that it barely reached that far, so with a courage that few people could have mustered, the librarian went back to the library to look. There was no sign of anyone close to the library door. The librarian took out his keys and let himself back into the building. Was it possible, he wondered, that Robertson had really succeeded in returning the book from his grave? But when he searched the reading room upstairs, there was no sign of the missing volume. The poor ghost was only able to express the will to return the book. It lacked the material means to convey a real object from the grave to some other place. The librarian thought that no harm had come to him from his encounter with the ghost, but he was sadly mistaken. Perhaps as a result of inhaling the grisly smell of the tomb that surrounded the spectre, he fell ill with an infective disease. Very soon he too was in his grave, though he slept there more soundly than Robertson did. Over the years, many people saw Robertson's shade, with the ghostly book still clasped to its chest. This always happened when they were at the library after dusk, and especially in the autumn months. Everyone who saw him died within a month or two of the sighting. Often it was from some lingering illness, but a few died outright of heart failure upon seeing the spectre, who grew more ugly to look upon as time went by, mirroring the process of decomposition that was undoubtedly taking place underground. Perhaps 70 years after the events I've described, a librarian of Innerpeffray who was more bold and resolute than his predecessors determined to rid the building of the ghost once and for all by opening Robertson's grave and physically removing the book. Nowadays, this would mean a good deal of bureaucratic fuss and bother, and possibly an outright refusal from the authorities, but in those days things were more straightforward. And let us not forget that the kirkyard of Innerpeffray is in an isolated location where no prying eyes were likely to see lights and shovels being carried in. The widow Robertson was long dead, so there was nobody to object when the grave was opened. The new librarian himself supervised the work, a stern figure in his dark frock coat, a lantern held aloft in his gloved hand. 2 stout labourers from the village did the work, hacking away at the thick clotted earth with shovels until they were hot and perspiring. Slowly and laboriously they cut away the rich soil until they were standing chest deep in an earthy-smelling hole from which the pale worms writhed fatly. Presently one of the shovels touched the lid of a coffin. The 2 men cleared the remaining earth from the lid with grimy hands and then leaned back, looking up for the librarian's nod to tell them to go ahead and open it. The librarian nodded grimly, and one of the men began to lever up the lid with the blade of the shovel. The wood was rotten after so long underground and gave little resistance. After a few moments the rim had splintered and the lid could be swung back without difficulty. The smell that issued from the coffin made both men turn their heads with curses, and the librarian himself pressed his handkerchief over his nose as he leaned over the grave, searching with his gaze for the unreturned book. Alas, book was there none. Neither was the body of Robertson in the grave. the librarian's revolted gaze fell upon what were clearly the remains of a woman, the brown and grinning skull nestling among skeins of dry yellow hair. The corpse wore a dress of spotted and discoloured silk, completely rotted through in places so that the bones supporting the fabric were visible through the holes. Bones, hair and rotten silk filled the entire coffin. It was clear that there was no book inside nor space for one, but of course why should there be? It was the wrong grave altogether. The librarian ordered the broken coffin lid to be replaced as carefully as possible and the grave to be refilled. There was no question of trying another spot. As far as records and local knowledge went, that plot should have housed the body of Mr. Robertson and the library's missing book. It did not, and the librarian did not see his way to exhuming half the kirkyard to find them. So the book of Scottish flora and fauna has never been returned, and the ghost of Robertson has never found peace. On dark autumn nights he still tries in vain to return the volume, dragging his crumbling bones along the path between the kirkyard and the library, the spectral book clasped against his empty ribs. And woe betide anyone who comes face to face with him in the dark, for within the space of a few weeks they too shall be dead.
I would like to thank Lara Haggerty, librarian at Innerpeffray, for organising and hosting the Ghost Story evening, and Ralph Haggerty for making this excellent audio recording. If you would like to visit the Library of Innerpeffray, you can find details at http://www.innerpeffraylibrary.co.uk/. If you would like to know more about my books, visit my website at http://www.helengrantbooks.com/ or follow me on Twitter at HelenGrantSays. Thank you for listening.